For joining our live stream today. My name is Eric.Kimberling. I'm with Third Stage Consulting, and we do weekly live streams talking about digital transformation. And today we're going to have a guest on whom I'm going to introduce in just a moment to talk about a current engagement that we're working on at the Third Stage team. And it's we want to talk about some of the lessons learned from this transformation that's actually in progress. And so one of the interesting things, or one of the things we like to do occasionally on this live stream, is to talk about not just looking in the past from a project that's already been completed, but talking to team members that are actually right in the middle of a transformation, right in the middle of a project, and sort of talking about the good, the bad, the ugly, the fun stuff, the not so fun stuff, and all the stuff that we all deal with when we go through transformation. So that's really the intent of today, is to talk about a mid-sized consumer packaged goods manufacturer that we're working with and helping them through their transformation. We're in the midst of an ERP implementation with them. So we're going to talk today about some of the lessons learned and just kind of what's happening in the project and what are some of the curveballs that have been thrown and all that good stuff. So that's really the intent of today's conversation. And before I introduce our guest, I also wanted to ask everyone, if you don't mind, a couple of favors. First of all, if you have any questions or you want to engage with us at any point on whatever platform you're watching today, whether it's YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook, please just drop a comment or question in the chat. I'm watching the live streams here as we're talking, so I'll pull questions from the audience as we go. And then the second thing, if you don't mind just dropping in the chat right now just where you're joining from today. We generally appeal to a pretty global audience. We generally get people from all over the globe watching these live streams. So I always like to see where everyone's from, just to get a sense of who our audience is. So if you don't mind, just drop in the chat box where you're joining from today. I'd love to see where you're from today. So the last thing I'll mention before I introduce our guest is this interview is live. We're recording this live here on the platforms I mentioned, but we're also going to use this recording later for our Transformation Ground Control podcast, the episode that will come out next week. So thank you for being part of us making this podcast, and you'll get to see the polished, edited version next week when it comes out on our Transformation Ground Control podcast. So with that all being said, we'll talk a little bit more about the case study here in a moment. But before I do, let's introduce our guest, which is Amanda Patton, who is a manager at Third Stage Consulting on our team, helping with this client that we're going to talk about today. So Amanda, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And you've been on the podcast before, but it's been a while. You were on one of the early episodes of Transformation Ground Control. So it's good to have you back on here.
Glad to be back.
Yeah. And you're going to talk about a different project, I believe, this time than what we talked about before, or maybe it was the same project. Was it?
It feels like
I don't remember.
I don't know.
Several months ago. So now I don't remember, but either case, a lot has changed. If it was the same project we talked about before, this is a project that you've been working on for some time with us. But
Yes.
I guess before we start asking about the client and a little bit about the company, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, just a little bit about your background and what you do at Third Stage in general.
Okay. Sure. Well, let's see. I've been around the software world, I guess, for the past 8 to 10 years in different capacities. Was with IFS, so on the vendor side, and did global analyst relations, was an industry manager, and the strategic alliances lead. And so over the years did different roles, which was really cool because I got to see the whole entire process from different vantage points and learned a lot just from, selection and, how customers select and how they implement and what that all looks like. So it's pretty cool to have kind of a mixed bag of skill sets from, in that regard. And then at Third Stage, we tend to kind of wear multiple hats around here and work on really cool collaborative teams, and people bring, a diverse set of skill sets. And the majority of the projects that I'm on, I'm really doing project management. Overall, do some analysis and a lot of, that kind of thing, from organizational readiness and the selection process and that kind of thing. But really, project management is kind of my go-to here lately, especially on the last few projects I've been on.
Great. So you'll have a unique perspective that a lot of us don't have, just having worked for a software vendor in the past, and you've sort of been on the other side of the table, and be interesting to get your perspectives as we talk here today, how that what that contrast is, between being on this side versus the vendor side, and understanding those challenges in a different way, having been on that side.
Yes. Yes.
Sure.
I know all their secrets. So,
Right. The dirty little secrets of
yes.
being a vendor.
Yes.
So, so tell us a little bit about this client. I know we can't mention him by name, obviously, for confidentiality purposes, but just tell us a little bit, at a high level, kind of what is the lay of the land as far as the company itself. What do they do? How big are they? All that good stuff.
Right. So they're consumer goods, as you have mentioned, a mature, established company, mid-size enterprise, and they sell direct to consumer and a lot of business to business as well. Um, I don't know. I can't go into too much more detail, I guess, without revealing,
Who they are.
identities. So yeah, that's pretty much the overview.
Okay. And they're very well established, as in they've been around for centuries, not
Exactly.
not
Yes.
10 or 20 years, but hundreds of
Very
years.
mature. Very, very mature.
Yeah, which is
And
which
I'll
can be a
talk
good thing and a bad thing.
exactly. And I'll kind of talk a little bit about that more as we get into the interview. But as you can imagine, there's just a lot of legacy, old processes, old technologies, old ways of doing things, and also the economy and the way that we do business and the way that consumers behave and the way that they purchase things, and just that whole entire world has shifted. And so there's a lot of change going on, within this company just because of all of the evolutions they've gone through. So, and then with COVID, it's like a whole new, fast tracked evolution. So,
Right. Well, tell us a little bit about the transformation itself that they're going through as an organization, and sort of where are they in that journey? Maybe start from how we started working with them and kind of leading up to where we are today. How would you sort of summarize that journey so far?
so they had gotten to the point a lot of companies get to where the technology they had and the processes they had were not only not ideal, but were starting to actually hold them back, right? And so they came to us with, we just need help, right? We need help understanding what we don't know, what's available to us, looking at our current state, comparing it against other manufacturers, in similar, industries and size. And so that's really where it started. And we began with them with an organizational readiness assessment to really understand where they are around, technology, process, change. This is a really, really old system, legacy, green screen, everything's really manual. And um, it's almost like if you haven't been there for a long time and don't know your head, it would be really, really hard to come in off the street and use the technology to be able to do your job. And so, that causes issues with, accuracy, training, all of that kind of thing. Especially as you bring kind of in a younger, more tech savvy workforce, people expect for their systems at work to reflect, the way we do things in our regular lives using our phones and that kind of thing. So, there was just a huge disconnect between what they have and what they want to have. It started the selection process, right, where we go out and we start that, of course, with the process workshops, where it's this, painstaking but really cool and exciting exploration with the teams across, sales, customer service, production, across all the big functional areas, taking us step by step, what exactly do you do? And really laying out that in the way of, process maps and that, which helps us to really understand what are the requirements, what is current state, not what you want people to think it is, but what it actually is. And then what's future state, right? Where are we going? Where do we want to be? And what do we need from a process and technology perspective to be able to get there? And then running the actual selection, right? Doing analysis on all of the requirements and doing the demonstrations and having the customer weigh in on scoring those demonstrations. And then having two top vendors. Sometimes it's more, but in this case it was two. And they basically have a showdown and compete for the business. And then we had a winner, of course. And then now we are deep into the implementation, right? The design phase. We're getting ready to do user acceptance testing, and we're a couple months from go live. So we're pretty well into the project now.
Nice. Yeah, very very interesting. It's sort of like getting a lay of the land and understanding who they are and what they're trying to be in the future, so that we can figure out what system or systems would be the best fit for them. Um,
Exactly.
so we're see that was a good overview of sort of where they are in the process, what sort of triggered or initiated this whole transformation. What type of technology? We try to be pretty vendor agnostic. We are vendor agnostic as an organization, but in these discussions and podcasts, we try to be fairly vendor agnostic and not bash any one vendor or be overly positive about any vendors in general. But what can you tell us about the type of solution that we ended up recommending and that they ended up implementing?
Yes, I'm not going to get too specific, but I will just say, it's a solution that's built for manufacturing, right? And so you have all of the functionality that you would expect for that type of company, and all the bells and whistles that you would expect to find for a company who manufactures. So, um, you know, a lot of manufacturers tend to be on premise, and there's been a huge shift, right? Or there is, I guess we're kind of in it now, where people are trying to modernize their systems and people are going to the cloud, and there's all these big questions, and there's a lot of it's hard to leave behind all of the things that they're kind of used to. And so it was even a huge change management component, I guess, or the beginnings of it, where it's such the delta is so massive between green screen, hotkeys and all the things that people do and have been doing forever, to this modern, where things are more icons, and it's just very different, right? So I think it was off-putting, but also exciting for them. But the vendors we pulled in obviously were based on who can satisfy the requirements. So for them, it was pretty much all manufacturing centric technologies solutions.
Right. So they end up with a sort of a tier two industry focused solution rather than, it wasn't an SAP or an Oracle or a Microsoft, sort of one of those big broad vendors. It was more of a focused solution.
Right. And I think that would have been over engineered for them given their size and what they're trying to do anyway. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, in the process so far, I guess first of all, where in the implementation are we right now in helping them? So what phase of the overall implementation, or kind of what's next? What are some of the immediate milestones we have coming up?
So last week, actually, we just finished the end-to-end, just the full, end-to-end. And we're getting into now preparing for UAT. And really the specifics of, writing all the scripts for the user acceptance testing, make sure it's not boilerplate, right? That we have really specific nuances to this particular client, understanding that they do have a secret sauce. They do have ways they do things that differentiate them from their competitors. And so, getting into looking at what happened in the end to end, what's working, what's not. Massive decades upon decades worth of data is being continually deduped and scrubbed and reformatted and just all of that, right? And so a lot of that's getting moved over from pilot to production. There's just a lot of those types of things as we prepare to be able to test. But that's where we are now, right? Deep preparation for user acceptance testing.
Okay. Yeah. So this is where a lot of the rubber meets the road, and a lot of the challenges and hiccups and all that sort of stuff starts to get exposed, really, is during that end-to-end process design, and then the user acceptance testing, as you mentioned. What are some of the challenges that we've seen so far? Just kind of looking at where we are in the journey with them right now. What are some of the biggest challenges we're facing now, or that we faced so far leading up to now?
Well, like I said earlier, and this continues to just be a theme, it's just a massive change, right? Legacy green screen essentially very manual, institutional knowledge kind of thing, and very you've got to go in and mine for data and like build custom report. It's not the way we're used to, where you can just go query for what you want. There's just a lot of, so I think one of the biggest challenges is like not knowing what they don't know. And with each iteration of these design and configuration sessions and these conversations, and then all of the sidebar conversations happening around business processes and like what needs to change and why does it need to change, and does everyone agree that it needs to change, and also not operating in their own little silos, but making sure that everyone had this broad view across all the teams of like, if we make this change, this is going to impact this over here. What does that mean from a process perspective, technology perspective? So I think that's one of the huge challenges, is just you're asking an entire corporation to recalibrate and shift perspective, individually and collectively, which is, it's a lot to ask. There's also the stress of learning an entirely new system, right? That looks nothing like what you're used to. If you're going from one modern ERP to another, it's probably not that big of an adjustment, right? But when you're going from, legacy to what they're going to be using, it's been huge. We've also had a lot of, issues with the vendor that's caused heartburn. Some of these things can't really be predicted. It just depends on who the team is, the consultants that are deployed from the vendor side, the project manager, their product roadmap, what changes they're going on, what changes they have going on behind the scenes. And so making sure that, we as the neutral party, right, in the overall project, that we are advocating for the customer, that we are kind of giving the vendor a really hard time sometimes when they're not doing what they said they were going to do. In the sales cycle, it was said like this is what we're actually seeing. What's the deal? Creating mitigation plans, asking for, rebates or things like that. Just making sure, because look, the customer, they have a full-time job to be doing, for one thing. They have a day job to like keep the company running. They also now have a part to full-time, depending on their role in the project, on this implementation. The last thing they could be working 60, 80 hours a week for a period of time to get this thing implemented, depending on their involvement. The last thing they have time to do or the capacity to do is go chase down the, things that the vendor said that aren't necessarily happening the way they should be. So it's really good to have a neutral party, because like we've talked about before, at some point we roll off of these projects. This is a long-term relationship between the client and the vendor. And so I am always working to make them, get them to communicate with each other. And I will be, the bad cop or whatever. I'm happy to do that. But to have that communication, to know who to escalate to, who do I go to? Where do I submit a ticket? How do I make sure that this has been, resolved, those kinds of things. And there are just so many people involved that can get really, really chaotic very quickly. So, I think that's one of the main things right now.
So you and I were talking before we went live here. We were talking about how we're working with the vendor's direct services group. So in other words, we're not using a third-party VAR or a system integrator. This is actually the vendor itself providing the technical resources to manage the implementation, which in theory, you'd think that should be an easier, more smooth sailing process because you're dealing directly with the vendor. We're getting resources straight from the vendor.
Right.
Who better to know the product than the vendor themselves? And so in theory, it should be a easier process, or you should, in theory, have better resources because of that. Now, but that hasn't necessarily been the case, has it? I mean, there's been some challenges that we do see often, but we don't see them with all of our implementations. You and I were talking about another implementation you're involved with where it's like just a totally different experience.
Right.
What are some of the challenges with the vendor? Like, what are some examples of challenges we've run into with the vendor themselves?
So to your point, every single project is completely unique, right? it's because it deals with human beings and different technologies, different deployment teams, and so every single one is completely different. And I was under the same impression as well, because you would think that, people who are employees of the vendor, that would be better, right? It would be closer to the source instead of having a bunch of, outsourced um, things. But, what's ended up happening is that there's just a lot of disjointed disorganization, miscommunication. A lot the vendor has going on behind their own scenes has caused a lot of pain for the customer. There are a lot of upgrades and just a lot going on with their product roadmap. Let me just say that. And
Right.
so those changes are causing glitches and delays and confusion for the process of the implementation for the client, right? Because you know how everything is, you've got this critical path, you've got all these dependencies. And so if this thing gets messed up, well, now we've got to rework all of, um, if somebody, that's one of the issues we've had with this vendor, is that they've laid things out and then those things are continually changing. It's like chasing a moving target, and it's really difficult when, like I said, you've got people over here trying to learn a new system. They're trying to write new processes for future state of their company. They're trying to work their day jobs. And so, and their schedules are really full, right? And so it's just caused a lot of extra uh, you know heartburn. Another thing too, I don't know if you've ever, called customer service somewhere and you've been transferred 17 times and you've had to tell your story over every single time.
Right.
Even though the person says like, yeah, I'm going to put this in the notes. That has sort of been the experience for the customer as well, right? Even though you have these are, employees of the vendors. It's not like it's a new outsourced team or some third party team. This is all, people who work for the vendor. But every time they come on to talk about building out a new module or a new, component, we've had quite a few experiences where the cloud environment hasn't been spun up yet, right? Oh, we thought you were on-prem. Sorry, we need 2 weeks now to spin up the cloud environment so we can do this training and this configuration, things like that. We don't have 2 weeks, right? Also, that pushes so many other things back now. And then just kind of the thing where you get on the phone and you expect if you're the client, you expect the vendor to know who you are, what you do, how big you are, where you're located, your whole story, and the fact that you're on the cloud and that you're using this product and that, and that just has been missing. Right? It's almost like they have to tell their story from the beginning every single time. And that obviously hurts confidence. It makes people feel worried. It makes people feel like, is this implementation going to go well? What's going to happen on go live? It doesn't seem like they're really paying attention to what we want and what we need. So that's been a huge frustration. And like I said, you have, I would say, I'm trying to remember from the organizational readiness assessment, I think it was 89, 90% of the people who work for this company have never been through an ERP implementation ever. So this process, the methodology, all the meetings, all the acronyms, all the just the language, everything about it is completely foreign, right? And so people are already a little bit, just worried and insecure. It's a new experience for them. I think that's completely normal. And it doesn't help when the vendor shows up and seems like they don't know what's going on, right? It's really frustrating. So,
yeah. Now you had mentioned too, you were talking a few minutes ago about just now you were talking about the different modules, you setting up different modules and all that goes into that. So you've got so many dimensions of things to think about from a technology or a software perspective here. You have the different modules you're going to use, whether it's cloud or on-prem, and a lot of things are specific to that solution. But then there's also, in this case, and in many cases with a lot of our clients, there's third-party bolt-ons that go along with that to fill in some of the voids with the product roadmap, to your point earlier.
right.
If this product doesn't have certain functionality, we don't have it, but here's a third-party option that could sort of fill that gap. There's been issues with that as well, have there not? Or what are some of those challenges with those third-party apps and how it all sort of comes together?
Yes. Lack of communication again. Finding out at this stage in the process that things that were bought, in the sales process now, oh well, we're sunsetting that. We're coming out with this new thing to replace it, but it's not going to be available to work with single sign-on in a cloud environment until June of next year. And so you're like, well, what are they supposed to do between go live and when that happens? And so again, lack of communication, maybe even from the product people to the sales team. Maybe the sales team didn't know about this during the sales process. I'm not saying there was any malice or like intentional misleading going on. It's just in my mind, and the reason we're here and we're vendor agnostic is because we advocate for the client. We are here for the client. That's where my loyalty lies. And so it's frustrating when those types of things are being revealed so late in the process, because then you have to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, well, do we really need this functionality? Do we really need it day one? How critical is it? And trying to figure, out kind of workarounds really to make sure that the functionality is available. The other thing too is what they purchased initially in the sales cycle to cover that particular functionality that I'm referring to. The new product is going to be more expensive, right? So then there's a hit to the budget as well. And so, and then maybe potentially some APIs and some other, work that has to go on behind the scenes to make it work, because now it's a different, so again, it's never one thing. It ends up going down 50 different rabbit holes because it's connected to so many other components of the project. So yeah, we've had quite a few issues with modules that were bolt-ons that actually serve really important functionality that the client needs. So again, we're now talking about UAT, and we've got all these scripts, and we're getting everybody ready, and we're doing all the training around that, making sure that the data is there and that all the EDI work is being done, and talking about cutover planning and getting really, really granular about what that's going to look like during that time. And so we need to be focused on those things. And instead, we've gotten dragged back sometimes to kind of go rework some of these modules and things. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Now, you'd also mentioned a moment ago, you were talking about the organizational readiness and how 89 or 90% of the employees had never been through an implementation. And then you throw in some of these curveballs we're talking about that are vendor specific and related to the third party bolt-ons, and just some of the confusion around the product itself and which modules and bolt-ons are going to be required. But what about just the whole challenge? I guess the whole the fact that this is such a mature organization that's well established, which is good news, bad news, I suppose, when they're going through a change like this. The good news is that you have a certain amount of maturity around certain processes and certain things you do that are strengths as an organization. But when it comes time to change those things or to go through a transformation like this, the bad news is it can be a lot more difficult for a well-established organization to go through the changes, just because of that. Things are so well baked into the DNA of the organization that it's a lot harder to change. What are some of the biggest organizational change challenges or signs of resistance have you seen as it relates to the process changes or moving to a modern cloud-based ERP system versus that legacy system? What are some of the how's that going so far from what you're seeing at this point in the project?
I will say we're turning a corner. I'll put it like that. Early on, it was people are, it's human nature, right? You're attached to the way that you do things and protective over your process and your data and the fact that you own this and other people don't touch it. And, this is how we do things. I think too, when you have somebody who's been doing it this way for 30 years, and that's not an exaggeration, there are people who've been doing it this way on this system for 30 years. There has been a little bit of a mindset of why do we need to change it? It's fine. And so that's not a bad thing. And you talk about this all the time in your podcasts and blogs and all that of people aren't necessarily trying to be resistors. It's just a natural part of the process. And so for I think for this particular client, one of the hardest things, besides just the huge change from the type of technology they're using to where they're going, is the internal processes, right? Having pretty passionate discussions sometimes internally about this is why we do it like this. And other people or newer people or whatever, people in different areas, well, that doesn't make sense. That's not how people do it anymore. And so some of those conversations have been revisited, I'm not kidding, 7 or 8 times, right? Subsequent meetings, you got to pull in more people, we've got to reevaluate this, and um, looking at, well, why do we use LIFO, and why do we do it like this, and why are there four extra steps in this process when really all we need, and this is the whole crux of the issue, is that they don't know what the new technology is capable of. So they don't know that a lot of these manual steps that are part of their process are going to be obsolete. And you can't know that until you've played with and tested and seen your new system in action. And so there's a little bit of, trust. And like I said, every iteration of the UAT and them getting to get in there and play around and see it, like, oh, okay, well, it did it automatically, or this is automated now, or I don't have to slice and dice these 17 reports 8 different ways for 15 different people, because that's sort of the way it is now, right? You're pulling vast amounts of data, you're putting it into Excel, you're doing a million different things because all these people need different things. And in future state, it's not going to be like that. There won't be a need for that, right? There's going to be custom dashboards and there are reports you can query. There are all kinds of things that you can do to do that. But if you've never seen that kind of system or worked in that kind of system, you don't know. So I think that's one of the biggest change management issues, is telling people this is what it's going to be like, and they don't believe you. And
Yeah.
so but like I said, the more, because initially when people are in there playing around in the training modules and those types of things, it falls flat, because it's not real. But now that their data is in there and they see their customer names and they see their sales orders and they see, now it's starting to all make sense. Like, okay, I'm really starting to understand how this works. So that's been a pretty steep learning curve, and I think too, just being patient with people, and understanding that change is hard, and not trying to shame someone or make them feel like, come on, get with it. It's everyone has a very different reaction and different experience. I think too, it's always normal for people to start to think, this system seems to do a lot of what I do for my job. Right. And people are like, what, and that's kind of one of the points of, this type of system, is to get people away from having to be in the weeds all the time and do so much manual work, so people can focus on more strategic, forward-looking initiatives, right? Instead of being caught up in the work of all this manual stuff when you're bogged down with an old system. So
Yeah. Yeah. Now you mentioned something interesting that just triggered another sort of a sub question here. Is you were talking earlier, but just a second ago, about LIFO, like, which for those that don't know, last in first out way of valuing or costing inventory, and it's also an inventory management process too. But are there other, like, can you give us a couple examples of other impacts to the organization, like other things like that are sort of being challenged, or their mindset shifts for the organization or for different team members, no matter how small they may be? Do you have any examples like that?
I think, one of the things is okay, I'm trying not to get too specific so I don't, reveal anything that I'm not supposed to reveal, but what are the kind of rules, right? In terms of customizations, or this customer wants this. And that's been one of the huge things. When you're as old as this company is and you have as many longtime loyal customers as they do, you have a lot of exceptions, right, for customers. this customer only can have blue ink on their packing slip, or this
Right.
customer doesn't want this packaged with that. It has to be separated out, and these plastic sleeves have to be labeled in a different way because of how they receive inventory, or whatever. Special custom orders that a lot of companies would just say no to, right? Because it doesn't make sense at that volume. It doesn't make sense for them financially to fulfill those types of things. But this company does those things without exception because they're customer centric. And so a lot of it has been around the rules of what's allowed and what's not allowed, and setting, parameters around what's going to work for the business model. And across customer service, sales, production, you know, um, there were these kind of arguments about this may be better for the company from a convenience standpoint, but we don't care because we're always going to do what's best for our customer. And so those are some examples. And like I just said, like, the color of ink or the way things are packaged, or, just teeny tiny details that may not seem that important in the grand scheme of things, but to them they are, because they have a really, really loyal customer base. Trying to think of some other just small process things. I'll think
Well,
of something. It'll come to me.
no, that's a good one. I mean, but it's a good. I mean, even just the minute example of the color of ink, on a invoice or packing, what a packing slip looks like, or how how you separate the materials into different. I forgot how you said it, but how you package things for specific customers. You look at that in a software vendor would probably look at that and say, well, that's not best practice. Our software has best practice, which is a
Right.
more consistent way of doing things, and so that's what drives me crazy about that term best practices, because in this case you look at this client and say, well, is that best practice? The way the software works, is that really best practice when you have this customer centric customer experience that you're focused on? And those two things are oftentimes in conflict, and so you've got to resolve that and say, well, are we going to focus on efficiency and standardization and common processes, or are we going to retain that sort of customer centric model that we have? And I think that's where a lot of companies struggle, is like, what's the right
Yeah.
answer there?
Yeah, and if you don't know ERP speak, and you don't know what a future state looks like with this new system, you may just be able to be pulled around by the vendor, right? If they tell you you should do this, maybe you just do it because you don't know, you're not sure, and so you think, well, they're the experts. I guess we'll just do whatever they're saying. But um, and like you say this a lot in your stuff that you do is about, you've got to know what makes you special, right?
Mhm.
And sometimes, yes, there's a lot of best practices that can be applied across the board, but those are probably going to be pretty similar for most in that particular industry. But if you know that something is a key differentiator, and is the reason why your customers keep coming back, then regardless of best practice or not, or what the vendor thinks about it, you know your business better than anyone. Like, a vendor can't tell you how your business is on a day-to-day basis. You're the one who knows it. You do it every single day. So you have to be the source of those decisions. And would it be easier to go with best practice to make things more convenient for the company? Yes, at the expense of their customer experience, though, which they're not willing to do, right? Which is why they're so successful. So, you have to pick and choose those things. And sometimes those things require customizations, right? And that costs a little bit more money, and it's going to take a little bit more time. But in the end, it's important for this customer to be able to do that for this client to be able to do that for their customers. And there's all these little conversations about backflushing. Should we be backflushing? Should we auto invoice? There's price breaks. Where should the price break happen? We have, they're putting out catalogs with new pricing. But these old customers are grandfathered in at this rate for all of eternity, right? And all of that has to be accounted for in the software. So I think that's really what it is.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's good stuff. Now, how in general, I don't know if you have a good answer for this yet, just because I know we're in the middle of things. But if you do have a good answer for this, I'd be curious to see what you think. When you look at the sort of that call it a tension or a trade off between sort of vanilla software deployment and sort of what the software can do off the shelf versus business processes and some of the stuff you were just talking about, some of the variations and exceptions and things that are focused on making the customers happy.
Right.
Assuming those two things are in conflict often, sort of where's the needle? Is the needle shifting? Which way is it going? Like how is that? How do you see that unfolding so far? Because I'm always curious about that because I feel like that's such a key point of tension. That's hard to get alignment as an organization on where you want to fall. And to your point, the vendor's probably pushing you more towards the vendor focused or the product focused answer, and that may or may not be the right business answer. So how do you see, I don't know if you have a good way to explain like where you think this customer is and where they're headed on that front.
We are in the thick of it right now, so I can report back later.
Sure,
um,
sure.
but a big part of it is, so like, for example, right when we started taking inventory of, okay, here's everything out of the box, here's what we know future state, here's what we learned in end to end, here's what we've learned in the build sessions that we've been in, and all the subsequent conversations that needed to happen around business process. We, I think, came out with 83 customizations, right? Whether those be forms, BPMs, reports, dashboards, like any type of customization, right? And so the process right now that we're going through is pretty painstaking, long conversations about, is it something that we really need? Is it something we need right now? Um, are we sure that the out of the box functionality doesn't address this? We just haven't looked at it in the right way yet, right? And so it's just that exploration of all of that. Of those 83 customizations, probably for phase one, for go live, there'll probably be about 8 to 10 that get moved forward. And so it's not straightforward. A lot of time the vendor wants to make it seem like it's straightforward, like it's like, oh, we'll just do this, right? Well, no, that's not going to work. And so, of course, that sets off a lot of other conversations. And it's been a really good exercise, I think, in the company really better understanding themselves and each other and where they've been, where they are now, and where they want to go. Even though everyone's agreed that future state is where they want to be, and be able to project trends and get better with like the whole Amazon world and, selling directly to consumers and 3PLs and all the, all the new things that have come in. It's still this, when people get worried or afraid or confused, we want to go back to what we know. Right. And so it's like a rubber band, and it's depending on the day, right? We can be anywhere on that spectrum. But I think the more that these conversations happen, they take a lot of time. And yeah, the easy thing is just to do what the vendor says, right? Okay, let's just shove you guys into a box that the functionality says that you should be in. Sometimes that makes sense, sometimes it doesn't. So I think it's been a really good exercise. It's been very eye-opening, I think, as departments understand what other departments are dealing with and kind of what that looks like. And there's a lot of overlap. There's a bunch of learning opportunities that they've had across different functional areas. So yeah, I don't have a direct answer.
Sure.
It's
No,
in
that's
flux.
helpful.
It's in flux. Yeah.
Well, that's super helpful because I think you said it well when you said, vendors do try to kind of force you into a box. And I think for a lot of organizations, you want to assume that whatever product or technologies you're deploying is the best fit of what what options are out there in the marketplace. In this case, it sounds like this probably is the best fit product for this client, but that doesn't mean it's a perfect fit, and it doesn't mean that the vanilla off-the-shelf software is going to address all of their needs. There are going to be things that are going to have to change on the technology side, and certainly the organization itself is going to have to change to adapt to the software. So it's sort of a two-prong change approach. But I think a lot of vendors would, to your point, they tend to oversimplify things and say, well, just do it the way the software does it. Well, that's easy to say when you're a software vendor because that's all you know, and
Exactly.
you don't have to live with the consequences day to day once you go live on that new system. And I think that's where I think it's good that some of those painstaking conversations are happening right now because that's a way to work through and make sure you've got clarity and alignment on what is it we can live with, what can't we live with, what do we need to change
Right.
ourselves, what do we need to change in the software, and all that stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's good that we're, that's where third stage comes in, is sort of that neutral party that can see across all the, the whole entire project, across the different dynamics and people jockeying for power and just all the different dynamics that are going on, which is just normal um, human nature, and being willing to have those difficult conversations and, not get too far into the weeds, but deep enough to where, okay, this is not going to work for us the way we need it to. And just having the vendor be accommodating, and um, you don't have to get a custom built house. But if you move into a house that's already been built and it's builder's grade, it works. The light fixtures work and the stuff works, but it may not be exactly what you want. I think that's the process we're going through. Is like it's okay, but it's not going to do it the way we need it to be done. And then having that discussion about, is it worth the extra money? Is it worth the extra time? Do we need the customization? What if we wait until phase 2 and let phase 1 really play out and just see how we're doing after go live for a few months, and then we can do a reassessment around some of these. And I think those 83 items are going to get moved at 8 to 10, and then the rest of them maybe will be pushed for a while, because like I said, they don't know yet what it's going to be like in the real world on their new system. So having the patience, and then of course having the processes written for workarounds and manual things in case something doesn't work, right? Being prepared for everything. So
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That makes total sense. So what, based on where the project is right now and some of the challenges that that the client and us are facing here, what what are some of the biggest takeaways you would leave for a team that's about to go through a similar sort of transformation? Are there lessons specific to this client, this project, that you'd say, here's some key takeaways or things to think about as you embark on your own transformation journey?
how much time do we have?
We could spend a whole hour just on that, but how would you summarize a couple of those things that the most immediate or highest priority things that come to mind?
I would say to allow more time than you think it's going to take. That's a big one. And I've already alluded to it several times. That means internal discussions across all teams, leaving that extra time to discover and explore things that are going to come up. I don't care how well planned out it is, there will be surprises and speed bumps in the road. And so having the time set aside for that. You also have to have time to let the steering committee and the board, right? Because that can take forever to get on people's calendars, to track them down, to let them look over the information. You may have to present the information to them so that they can go make a decision when it's really stuff that really has to be decided at a super high level. That has costs more time than we anticipated in some cases. UAT scripts, the data migration plan, again, more time than you would think, right? So put a 20%, insurance layer in there of time, because like we've talked about, people have full-time day jobs. They now have a ton of hours being added for the implementation. And so finding the time that we need for all these deep conversations sometimes that we have to have, it's really difficult to do. In fact, sometimes we're doing it at night or on weekends because there's no other time, right? What else? The EDI hardware definitely, especially right now with our global supply chain being clogged. That's a fun little surprise of it's taking how long to get the scanners, the scan guns and the printers and everything, right? You've got to have that stuff for go live. And so having months of lead time is really important, especially right now. Luckily we were prepared for that, so we're good. But if we hadn't been, we might be in trouble. I think having an extensive plan with every line item laid out, who's responsible, when it's due. Even if we're just coming in, even if third stage is just coming in from a QA/PM perspective, I still like to have everything covered. So because we have our team, we have the system integrator, we have the vendor, we have the client team. It's a lot of teams with a lot of lenses and a lot of deliverables going on. And so being able to track all of that, which is what I do, I want to track everything. For this one in particular, I would talk about, wanting to understand the vendor's roadmap And if they're going through a huge upgrade or they have a lot going on behind the scenes, knowing ahead of time before you sign a contract, what does this mean? What does this look like? And getting really specific and kind of beating them up on, getting answers, definitive answers. Um, any products that are being sold during the sales cycle, when you get around to implementing, has anything changed? Do you have any updates for us? What do we need to know? Is this going to work in the cloud? Does it work in a single sign-on environment? Just all these little details that, don't seem like a big deal until they don't work, right? And then it's a really, really big deal. And then if you have a client going from on-prem to cloud, just making sure that everyone understands the changes, the challenges, the benefits of what that actually means. Because a lot of times these older companies, will be on-prem and the cloud is just a whole nother universe, right? And what does that mean for all these customizations and all of that? And every single time there's an update, what is that going to look like for our internal IT team? And just really, really understanding, because again, it's a completely different world. So that's kind of a long list. I have many more, but those are the main ones that come to mind.
Those are good ones, especially, I like the part about the way you describe all the little things that are big things that can affect a timeline. There's a big difference between what a vendor says they could do in terms of implementing technology in theory versus implementing technology to fit a business and in actuality. Those two things oftentimes get disconnected in what the vendor thinks is possible versus what is realistically possible from an
Right.
organizational and operational perspective.
Yeah, and I would always also say too, that coming from the vendor side, just remember that there's salespeople,
Mm.
and really doing due diligence on, oh yeah, sure, we can do that, right? Really
Really?
understanding what that's going to look like, and also understanding how much of the hand holding is going to be done by the vendor. I think I had a much greater expectation of this particular vendor than what has been delivered. And so there's been quite a bit of disappointment and heartburn and even conflict at some points in the project, right? And it was explained during the sales cycle that this customer was not familiar with an ERP implementation and we're going to need a lot of extra help and assistance. And that has not been delivered. So a lot of times, if you've been working for a vendor for 30 years, all the acronyms and all the things you say, it makes perfect sense to you because you do it every single day. And making sure that that vendor really cares about that customer in a way that's going to explain things, break down the acronyms. What does this mean? How long is this going to take? How do we do this? How do we write a UAT script? How do we, right? Saying something needs to be done and understanding actually what it looks like to get it done, to write a plan to get it done, and helping your people, training your people on how to do it. There's just been a big gulf between what was expected and what's being delivered. So
yeah, that's good. That's good stuff. I mean, there's a very good, I think that's a good overview of some of the higher priority obstacles and challenges and pitfalls that organizations often face. We see that a lot of those things you mentioned, we see often with
right.
our other clients as well. And that's part of what we do is help manage and navigate those issues for sure. So, well, I want to thank you. That was a very good overview, and I know there's a lot more we could talk about. And in fact, we probably will want to have you back on to talk about, as we get even further into the process, what are some of the additional lessons and curveballs, and how did it go overall, all that stuff. So this will be a good one to build on at some future point if you're open to that. So I want to thank you for being on here today. This is a super helpful discussion.
Sure. Yeah, it was fun. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you to the audience for being here today. I know we had a couple questions come through toward the end here that we didn't get to. Apologies for that, but that's something we can always chat with you in the post on social media. We can maybe share some thoughts there with you. So thank you everyone for joining here today. Thank you again, Amanda, for being here.
Yeah.
And this live stream or this recording will be part of our Transformation Ground Control podcast, which will come out a week from Wednesday. So Wednesday of next week, that episode will feature this interview along with other stuff that we'll include in that podcast episode. So thank you again, everyone. Hope you have a great day and a great week, and we will see you all soon. Thank you.
See you later. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks again, Amanda. Bye.